Thank you, Dan. I always feel a little nostalgic on this issue. The issue of, and as any of you follow Donnybrook, I think I'm just, to me, the issue of legalizing marijuana is so basic and so fundamental that it's, a lot of us look for the low-hanging fruit on legalizing it for medicinal purposes, which is, of course, you would think would be so obvious that everybody would be for it. But we go back a long way on this, and I guess to talk today from a media perspective, this reminds me, and it's on the same arc as the issue of gay marriage. And the two, have gone from the unthinkable to what I see today from, again, public perception, media perception. This is sort of like a movie that you know the end to, which is, we're going to win this battle. We're going to win it. It's just a question of how and when and where. I'd love to sit here and say that Missouri is going to be a great battleground for this. If it tracks like other social issues, unfortunately Missouri will be among the last states to do anything. I mean, Missouri was the last state, had to be dragged kicking and screaming in 1967 into, in fact, only the U.S. Supreme Court requiring all the states to legalize interracial marriage in 67. It was the last state, one of the states that had to be dragged kicking and screaming and getting rid of its sodomy laws. And I mentioned the gay marriage thing for a reason. Dan and I go back on that one too, and it reminded me, if you happen to, if I can shamelessly plug the May issue of St. Louis Magazine, for some reason, Siri wants to talk to me. The May issue of St. Louis Magazine, I wrote about the subject of gay marriage, and it was nostalgic for me because 41 years ago, I was writing editorials on this subject, and just to show you how far we've come on that issue, at the time the issue there was gay liberation being, a group called Gay Liberation being recognized to hold meetings at the University of Missouri, and the Board of Curators said no. They hired a fact finder who, among other, a guy named Cullen Coyle, the Jeff City attorney, who, among other things, found that to allow gays and lesbians to meet on campus would be, among other things, to allow sick and perverted people to counsel one another, to violate Missouri laws on sodomy, to encourage latent homosexuals to become actively homosexual. And this is in 1973, not 1873. Well, when Dan and I were in college, I think the amount of people that favored legalizing pot was 18%. Today, and you may have talked about this earlier, the Pew research that just came out found 52% of Americans say they favor legalizing marijuana, and I always think those surveys underreport. They certainly underreport the number of people that use pot or smoke pot or whatever. Because I mean, you're taking a phone survey and you think you're talking to the DEA. I suspect a lot of people don't do it. And a little known fact, I don't know how many have seen me talk about this before, we did have drug testing at the RiverFront Times when I was there, which surprises people. And our policy was that if we found one of our employees using illegal drugs, we and the management team tested their drugs ourselves. And we would give them back some of them if they were good, unless they weren't good, which they got them all back. But on this issue, it's much like, as you see with gay marriage, it isn't going backwards. The social train is like a locomotive, and it may move at different speeds, but it isn't going backwards. This issue has moved, what is it, in the last 3 years, it's moved like 11 points on the Pew. And the details were right. First of all, marijuana, when the polls are showing over 70% of the people have tried pot, those people know it is not a gateway drug. They know it's not a dangerous addictive drug. And they know that if you want to talk about this, and again, I think from a media standpoint, we ought to be talking about it vis-a-vis alcohol rather than vis-a-vis other drugs that don't enjoy major corporate sponsorship. Too often, I know some libertarians here, too often we get down a road of just talking about it as a libertarian issue, in which case people bring up cocaine and heroin and crystal meth, and I think it's unhelpful for those of us that want to see pot legalized to do that. I wish everybody could have the experience I had last summer. We went to Amsterdam, and I have had one problem over the years with pot, which is I cannot roll a joint to save myself. And you can go into what looks like just a regular bar in Amsterdam, and they have a little placard up there, just like and it's very much like buying wine. Instead of it being wine, where they tell you the vintage and you tell you a little about it, they have like a list of, most of the probably 15 different choices of what kind of pot you want to buy, and they have the winner of such and such an award and so forth. And it comes not only in a perfectly rolled joint, but with a filter on it. I mean, it's just amazing. And you think, what possible reason don't people understand that that makes sense? I mean, again, if I was at Anheuser-Busch, and I'm a big client and fan of Anheuser-Busch, but it's very similar in terms of why the reasons for recreational drug use, whether it's alcohol or pot, are virtually the same, are very similar. And neither one of them is especially nutritional, but neither one of them is particularly dangerous when used in moderation. And when used not in moderation, they're not so good. So it's a very similar situation to alcohol. And here, when you look in a state like Missouri, you look at the amount of resources we spend in the law enforcement area on apprehending and prosecuting and incarcerating people for drugs that don't enjoy major corporate sponsorship, illegal drugs. It's a terrible waste of resources. It's why that same Pew research found that 72% of Americans said, 72% said they did not think that government enforcement efforts on marijuana were worth the price. 72%, and that includes 2/3 of Republicans. Keep in mind, this isn't a partisan issue. There is a gap between Democrats and Republicans of about 20 points still on legalizing pot. Those who identify themselves as moderate or liberal Republicans, which I think is admittedly only about 22 people, they are slightly over 50% of those folks favor legalizing marijuana. So but the most important thing to remember here is it's going to happen. It's a question of how and when it is. Again, I think medicinal marijuana should be the low-hanging fruit. Anyone who suffers from coma, the side effects of chemotherapy, and other illnesses, the idea that we would deny those folks access to whatever drugs would ease their suffering and help them recover is just really immoral. And it's amazing that you can't get that discussion going. But as I say, I'll be the first to admit, I'm interested in this issue because I think pot should be legal. I just think it should be. I don't think there's any justification that I can even imagine, and I've felt this way for, as long as I can remember. And of course, when you're talking about pot, I don't remember it. But there's just no justification for it. And when you look at the cost to incarcerate people, the cost to the law enforcement the agencies, and really the human cost of our policy of prohibition, which has worked about as well as prohibition did for alcohol, there's really no reason to be pursuing it at all. And as I say, I think from a media perspective, it's really interesting to see where once upon a time, if you talked about pot legalization, it seemed hopeless. It seemed absolutely hopeless. Dan mentioned the RFT. When I had the RFT, I was president of the National Association of Alternative News Weeklies, which is papers like the RiverFront Times. And Dan, who, by the way, how about a round of applause for Dan Beast for what you guys did? No one's ever fought the fight better. One of my favorite memories of this, actually, is Dan asked me when I was president of the Association of Papers nationally to come to the National Association, normal, nationally. And when I first got there, it was a hotel room pretty much like this, a hotel. It was actually, I was there the night before, there was like a little hospitality thing. And I was struck by how straight this was. I mean, I went down there, and it was just like it could have been, you know, meeting of the Republican Party. I mean, it was just wine and cheese and hors d'oeuvres and stuff. And it seemed so, you know, not really hip, you know, it was just a regular old thing. And I went back to my room for a while, I was kind of bored, and came back down about an hour later after I did stuff, and it was billows of smoke in this like Marriott conference room. And it really reinforced my belief in the folks running NORML, because it was, you couldn't breathe, it was so cool. So it was kind of made me happy. And none of us got popped. But in any case, I think for those of you who want to fight this struggle in Missouri, the best thing you can do, and obviously Nash, I heard you some talk. I'm a big supporter of President Obama, and I can't think of an area I'm more disappointed in that we have not, at the national level, come to our senses. This should be an interesting coalition. I know a lot of Tea Party people support this. Those who believe in states' rights shouldn't look themselves in the mirror if they think that the federal government should overrule the will of the people in Colorado and Washington, and really any of the states that support medicinal marijuana. And I guess you've probably talked about this, but Missouri's in about the bottom half now. About 25 states have either decriminalized marijuana, legalized it, or at least legalized medicinal marijuana, and about 25 haven't. Surprisingly, Illinois is one of the ones that has not, and I suspect that'll change in the near future. And Missouri, you know, is going to take time, but I think that the most important thing to do, in my mind, is just keep pushing common sense. I think those of you who do have needs for medicinal marijuana, I'm always looking for folks to talk to us about that. You can talk to me afterwards if you know of individuals who are suffering or could have a good story to tell in that respect. And then don't think of this as a partisan issue. I think there's a great deal of common ground. The gap between the political parties is not nearly as severe as it is on a lot of issues. And even, I mentioned gay rights, there's a bigger gap on that one than there is on this. And again, just recognize this for what it is. It's a social trend that the train's left the station. It's not coming back. We are going to win this. And that's not how I felt 20 years ago when we were talking about it. And it's certainly not how we felt 40 years ago. But right now, we are winning, and we'll continue to win, because we're on the side of right. I mean, there's no reason, there's no justification for prohibition against marijuana. And to the extent we focus on marijuana, and don't broaden this into all other drugs, because I think it's very unhelpful, and there's different issues with different drugs. I think focus on this issue, and you'll find more and more. I think that 52% that favor legalizing marijuana is low. And I have trouble finding anybody who really wants the government to put people in jail, for example, for marijuana. I don't, and generationally, the other last thing I'll say about the Pew thing, and I'll throw it up with some questions. This is just like the gay issue, and I bring it up for a reason. It's generational. If you look at the Pew research, 2/3 of millennials, that's those of you born since 1980, 2/3, or just under 2/3, favor legalizing marijuana. And you get down to Generation X, and it's in the high 50s. You get to my generation, which is the baby boomers, and it's at 50%, which is an amazing statement of hypocrisy, seeing as how our generation is the one that was supposedly, you know, trying to change things. And then even among people who are, I think they call them the silent generation, it's folks either pushing 70, if you're out on the other side of it now, you're talking about pushing 70 or higher. Even in that group, it's over 1/3 of the people favor legalizing marijuana, and that's a huge increase in the last 10 years, or the last 3 years actually. So this is not going anywhere but one direction. There is no chance that this issue is coming backwards, okay? It's just a question of enough people like yourselves doing the right thing and saying the right thing without regard to partisanship. Just talk, whatever access you have, whether it's to media or to legislators, you're doing the right thing by being here, and I encourage you to keep the fight. We're winning it, and certainly not overconfident in Missouri. It's going to take a long time, but we just got to keep fighting the fight, follow Dan's lead, and hopefully we'll have some victories. Does anybody, let's talk questions.
I'm going to use a word that's popular today, is evolve, okay? And how has it evolved for you being a supporter on Donnybrook and your publications in the type of emails you now get, maybe versus what you used to get? Do you get those contacts? Well,
and Bill McClellan and I, who've been on the air, actually, this is, believe it or not, we've been on Donnybrook 26 years. It's a good question as how it's evolved. Yeah, it was a Bill and I have always been for legalizing pot from the beginning, but it used to be an issue of some controversy, and it was, you know, and we'd get letters and so forth. Now, we never get a negative on it. You get some positive mail. But the public has evolved on it. From our perspective, it has, and to the point where even those, you know, and I can't say that all 5 of the panelists real actively favor legalizing pot, but the opposition to it is very muted.
Sarah Palin said, we'll be the 51st state to legalize pot.
Who said that?
Sarah Palin.
That's a great leader, great mind. I do, and again, I don't mean to burst anybody's bubble. Missouri is going to be a tough state. Missouri is just a tough state on social issues in general. Yes, sir.
What constituencies or what low-hanging fruit do you see out there in terms of outreach? Are there any particularly underserved or neglected groups of people that you would identify as particular targets?
You mean targets to get them to support it, or targets?
Yes.
Well, first of all, I think the media is much, you gotta follow the trend of pay attention to the Pew Research on age. And this is the way it's worked on the gay issue as well. It is a generational issue. So the younger the media and the younger the medium, that's the low. So I would start with social media. Social media is a place where is by definition more dominated by and influenced by millennials. And I would think that in terms of the effort to push for sanity in our drug policies, the big emphasis in my mind ought to be on social media, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, whatever. That to me is the place that you can get the most done the quickest in terms of pursuing any kind of strategy to get the word out. And again, I think you really follow it. The younger the media folks that you talk to, so when you're talking to the alternative press, you're going to have a pretty receptive audience. In terms of coverage, I think clearly, you know, I'd start with social media. If that's, I don't know if that's specifically what you're asking about. As I'm going back to medicinal marijuana, probably the best place to fight this in Missouri still is that. I mean, it's probably the most logical, and that's why I'm always looking for microcosmic examples. That will make people, it's the microcosms that sell an issue like that, not the macro studies, okay? The microcosmic issues. And I hate to keep coming back to the same issue on gays, but it's been so much in the news. When you look at a Senator Portman, when his kid came out, or when he, you know, that affected him, and as it should. To the extent somebody gets, you've got examples of people who have been persecuted, and there aren't as many as there used to be, but to the extent there are microcosmic examples of people who have had their lives ruined because they had a bag of pot, those stories compel people. So I would look for microcosmic examples and try to get them in front of whether it's legislators or the media. So, yeah, oh, yeah.
I recently read an issue of the LA Weekly, and I was shocked to see the last 9 pages were just covered in non-stop ads for dispensaries, prescription doctors, for the medical marijuana. Is there any kind of, have you as a media guy thought about what the revenue implications for advertising, should this be legalized? Or?
I haven't, because I'm not in that business anymore. The LA Weekly and all, the alternative press has changed a great deal. Of course, I used to be pretty tight with those people who owned it at the time and so forth. I think one of the I'm glad you mentioned that though. One of the places to sell this is on revenues, on the revenue side, because we as a nation and as a state leave billions and billions of dollars on the table in the opportunity cost of not taxing marijuana. No one questions its usage. And by the way, if any of you here are members of organized crime families, I mean you no disrespect. Feel very, but organized crime and the drug lords would be the people that would pay the price if we had a system where, like they have in Amsterdam, where legally, I'm quite sure and it was, by the way, not expensive. To go buy a couple of joints was like, I don't know, it was 20 bucks or whatever it was. That 20 bucks was, taxes were collected on that $20. And think about, in a country where so many people smoke pot, I mean, there's no question about that. Think about how much revenue is left on the table because you're not paying 7% or whatever it is of the cost of the pot to the government. Just think about the billions of dollars that are, and it isn't billions of dollars that aren't going somewhere, but they're generally going to folks who are probably not paying income taxes on. Probably not paying incomes. If you buy a bag of pot, the person who sold it to you or up the food chain probably isn't paying income taxes to the United States government. And you think about the amount of resources we leave on the table, and maybe this is why the Tea Party and others have who don't like taxation, because this is a form of taxation. But the point is, it's just a ridiculous waste of money, a loss of revenue. Think about other items. Imagine pick another item that is widely purchased. If that item had no sales tax, just think about how much that costs us and how many services and either cutting other taxes, if you prefer, or services could be provided with the lost revenues.
Another way to look at that, I guess, is just that the cost of prohibition is, in fact, figured into marijuana in the black market now. So even from the perspective of someone who was willing to participate in the black market, use it now, use it whether it was legal or not, it would actually become less expensive after it was legalized and taxed.
Right.
So.
Well, that's one of the concerns. If you go to the White House website, sadly, they complain that marijuana would come down in price. Which I think is not a bad thing. But, it would cost the users less, but there is no question that at the end of the day, someone, if there were taxes coming back to the Missouri state government, which certainly could use revenues, and the United States government, that is a beneficial thing that people of both parties and all political stripes ought to be able to agree on. Yes, sir.
You've mentioned the coalition. I've heard that before between gay rights and the prohibition on marijuana. And they are similar, but has anybody thought about on the green movement? There's so many people involved in green this and being green and getting off petroleum oil. Cannabis does a lot of that for us as well.
Absolutely.
On the hemp side. But I don't hear too much of that in the media.
That's a good point. And by the way, I didn't say there was a coalition. I'm just saying that the gay rights movement and the gay marriage movement is tracking the same kind of arc as for the same kind of reasons, being driven generationally and being driven by people's experience. And that's one of the things I want to go back to. When I talked about that, I think this is one of the points you can make to people, is, do you remember the reefer madness kind of narrative that was there in the 20s and 30s that we used to sit around and get high and watch movies about? I thought it was pretty funny. That narrative has been disproven largely for one reason, and that is that the large majority of us who have smoked pot understand that it's nonsense. What happened on the gay rights movement through the gay libs of the world, and I talk about this in my editorial next month, is because it came out of the closet, because it was okay and cool to talk about being gay or lesbian, and because people opened up about it, everybody started having friends and relatives who they knew were gay or lesbian, and they were cool with it. And so they got the same, it was the experience. The experience of those of us who have smoked pot is that it is not a gateway drug and not a dangerously addictive drug, and it's not going to make you crazy and all the other stuff. And so that experience is what develops it. I think your point, though, on the green entity is great. I mean, and again, I think there's a measure on hemp, is there not, in the Missouri General Assembly? And you know, hemp has all kinds of uses. I bought some hemp. I was in Washington, and unrelated to marijuana being legal, at that great, if you ever go to Seattle, that great outdoor market they have, you know, you can get hemp products that are great for your skin, and you know, you would think that there would be a lot of synergy between the two. And so that is a good place to talk in the media about the fact that it is green, you know, and that it is, and hemp itself is a wonderful product with a lot of uses, and it always has had. But as I say, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Did you happen to read that article in the Post that was really negative about marijuana? Even said that it killed 5 people. It was published recently.
I did not see
His
it.
editorial from the National Council on Alcohol and Drug Abuse.
Yeah.
Who's that?
Dan Duncan's editorial on, I believe it was on Wednesday.
I didn't see it.
They didn't see it. Okay, never mind. I was going to
No.
see what your thoughts were on it. I was thoroughly disappointed with it. Couldn't believe that kind of. Did you read it, Dan? Yeah.
It wasn't the Post-Dispatch advocate. The Post-Dispatch
Oh, no,
advocate.
It was Dan Duncan, just a guest editorial.
Who is Dan Duncan?
He's he sits on the board of directors of the National Council of Alcohol and Drug Abuse. I believe it was in like Tuesday's paper, maybe. But I plan on writing a letter in response to it. It was a very bad editorial.
First of all, one of my pet peeves is the alcohol, and the Council on Alcohol and Drug Abuse should be filed under the Department of Redundancy Department. You know, and people on the alcohol, again, one of my favorite recreational drugs is alcohol, so no disrespect to its distributors and manufacturers, but it's a drug. It's a recreational drug. And it's so amazing, and this has been one of my things forever, is how the media works. You should point that out to people when you have a chance. When somebody says alcohol and drug abuse, that's drug and drug abuse. And again, I don't mean that to be offensive to people who, you know, legally and legitimately work for Anheuser-Busch. I assume most of you are from St. Louis, and St. Louis, Anheuser-Busch has been the best, most important corporate citizen we have, and they make a recreational drug. And they proud of it. That's not to denigrate. I once got up and said that to a group of high school students. I got an angry letter from the kid later because her dad was the vice president of Anheuser-Busch, and she thought I was calling him a drug pusher. Well, you know, I wasn't. I mean, I like Anheuser-Busch. And my point is, no one in St. Louis denigrates Anheuser-Busch. No one here thinks Anheuser-Busch has anything to apologize for the fact that it manufactures and sells a recreational drug. And having a cold, frosty one down at the old ballpark is part of our culture. Good for them. I mean, as I say, I'm not saying this facetiously. I mean, Anheuser-Busch has nothing to apologize for, you know, for what it does. But at the same time, you know, neither do people who want to smoke and legalize and distribute pot, you know. And one other thing I want to mention, there's an ethnic aspect to this too, because very often, I was fortunate enough to grow up. I mean, I fought my way off the streets of Creve Coeur. And for someone who was entrepreneurial in the inner city, particularly African Americans in the inner city, an entrepreneurial person, you want to talk about low-hanging fruit, very often the most available and really the only doable enterprise turns out to be drugs. So someone with a sort of entrepreneurial bent is likely following that and following all the good, you know, attributes that we supposedly attribute to those of us who are entrepreneurs. You know, that gets them into a situation where they're entrepreneurs in what's available in their community, which is drugs. That's unfortunately true. And everybody here probably knows the disparity, the horrendous disparity in how we treat cocaine and crack, which is cocaine. Same kind of thing with the language. You talk about crack cocaine, and what are the penalties? 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1, whatever they are. It's a horrible racist aspect of our society. But it goes to the words. It goes to the words like drug and alcohol, crack cocaine. And so I think people need to be very conscious of that aspect of this issue, because there's great disparity, socioeconomic and racial, in how we treat people with regard to drugs, and particularly how we punish them. And so, yeah.
You say you have nothing against Anheuser-Busch, but I've heard, maybe incorrectly, that they sponsor anti-marijuana causes.
I don't know that, well, when I say I have nothing against them, I'm not saying I endorse everything Anheuser-Busch does. I mean, I just think it has no reason to apologize for its existence. And my guess is, you know, that I don't know that for a fact, but if they did it, it wouldn't surprise me, because legalizing marijuana would not be good for the business of alcohol. I don't think there's any question about it. You know, and I don't know if you remember back in the 60s and 70s, when we actually thought we could legalize pot, one of the entities we thought would come along was the tobacco industry. And there was some talk, was there not, of R.J. Reynolds and other folks simply branching out from their drug, which, by the way, isn't all that benign. You know, tobacco as a drug is not all that benign. And by the way, I think that there's great analogy to be drawn between smoking marijuana and smoking tobacco with regard to public policy. So if somebody says, you know, I happen to not be for prohibition of, I'm a non-smoker of tobacco who does not believe in prohibition of tobacco and would fight against prohibition for tobacco. On the other hand, I have no problem with smoking bans in public places. I have no problem with a smoking ban on marijuana in public places. I don't think our right to smoke pot extends to blowing it in somebody else's face. And when you look at it in that respect, now the problem we got in Missouri is it's hard to even get some parts of Missouri to accept the idea of a smoking ban, but it doesn't somehow translate to pot being legalized.
Yeah, I'm from St. Charles County, and we in the last 3 years have had a sharp rise in heroin overdoses. And I can't quantify this with researches, and I can't do that. I can say that I speak to a lot of addicts, and especially young kids. They talk about getting caught up. Basically, the drug tests, it is easy to flush and fool a drug test on heroin, crack, cocaine. So kids do those and not smoking marijuana, and they get wrapped up. Yeah. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Thank you. What I was getting back to was, you mentioned race and disparity. Now that it's in the Chuck, St. Charles County, affluent,
Right.
do you think that it will still take as long in Missouri, or do you think it will gain traction because the right people with the right money and the right connections have their kids dying and getting caught up and getting put in a 120 shock for getting a dirty drug test?
Dan Beach is probably more qualified to talk about Missouri because he's such a passionate activist and works so hard on Missouri issues. I'm a bit of a cynic about the state of Missouri, quite honestly. I've followed its politics for a long time. Some of you may not know, but I was speechwriter for Kit Bond in his first term in 1975 and 1976, when he was a moderate to liberal Republican, which you may study it now in some kind of anthropology class. But following the government, I'm a bit cynical about anything happening progressive in the state. So I'd like to think that what you're saying would be true. It's the best thing I can think of is, from a standpoint of Missouri, and I was thinking about maybe writing about this, although I don't think my writing is necessarily going to influence much, and that is to focus on the cost to the criminal justice system of, so we're kind of talking, if you can focus on the cost to Missouri's criminal justice system in terms of incarceration of people, We still have an overcrowded prison system, and we have an underfunded prison system. And if we could start with some agreement with even those who identify themselves as conservative Republicans, that we need to do something about that, this would be, keep coming back to that phrase, low-hanging fruit, one place. You know, we haven't had federal judges emptying prisons lately, but if they did, one argument would be, let's talk about the non-violent drug-related offenders and why they should not be being paid, housed, and fed by our taxpayers. And that's sort of a conservative way to look at this issue, rather than make it an issue of, hey, I'm young and I want to smoke pot. The one thing clear is, to the extent we're going to make progress in Missouri, it's not going to be by defeating conservative, it's going to be by co-opting and bringing them into the 21st century on this issue. We are not going to defeat conservative Republicans and conservative Democrats by, you know, carrying signs and marching on Jeff City about our right to smoke pot. It's not going to work. But I do think there are areas of common ground, you know, and I guess you heard from Gary earlier about, you know, the Tea Party, for example, is, which I don't agree with on much, is a great area of common ground, because a lot of the instincts and a lot of the concerns about too much government and too much interference in our lives is shared by a wide range of Missourians. I wish there was a way that we could sort of link smoking pot to gun ownership. That would be the key. We could somehow, maybe we could do something where we legalize pot if you own a gun. That might work. But that's sort of where we are on social issues in the state. And I urge those of you who want to see progress on this not to be partisan and not to be combative, but to try to find common ground with the folks who dominate Missouri politics, which is the right wing of the Republican Party. Not at the statewide level, by the way. The statewide level, the Democrats control, but in case you haven't noticed, we have, in the last election, we had 6 statewide officials. 5 Democrats won. The only Republican one got caught in a pantless panty bar. What was it, Peter Kinder? And I like Peter personally, by the way. But, I mean, it's so strange that on a statewide basis, we keep electing Democrats, and Nixon's got, who's sort of a Democrat, has a veto-proof majority in both houses, which could be interesting by the end of the session. But my point is, if you want to go down and make yourself feel good by carrying a sign, fine, but I would urge you to think of ways to find common ground with those people who want less government, who want to see us cut the spending, corrections, and try to get through on that basis, in addition, as I say, to just trying at some level to appeal to human compassion on the medicinal marijuana issue. I think probably have time for one more question. You got another.
I have a comment. About a year and a half ago, I began reaching out to Ed Martin, who was then running for Attorney General on a number of issues, including marijuana. And he had a great conversation. You know, he agreed with me on most of the issues I brought to him. He told me that he also agreed with me on marijuana issues, but wasn't something that he could ever politically engage.
He probably appreciates you bringing that up.
Second. So there's more to this.
Has he admitted that publicly?
Well, so there's more to the story. Let me move on. A friend of mine, Mitch Richards, ran for as a Republican for the 47th district, and we reached out to. And during this campaign, the opposition, a Democrat who spent $400,000 to win the seat, found out that Mitch was involved with shady cannabis and made that an issue. He broke it on Jerry Berger's blog. So what happened was our Republican candidate actually got traction in his district because he was honest on the issue.
Right.
And Ed actually reached out to us and gave us advice on how to navigate the issue. You know, be honest, state your principles. And it's not to say that necessarily that things will happen one way or the other, but I think that there's more support in those echelons than we realize.
Well, that's good. And as I say, that's surprising to me. I mean, it doesn't comport with a lot of his persona on social issues, but it kind of supports what I'm saying, which is do not make this, this is the time, I think we're in a new phase in this. This is the time to feel quietly confident, not only in the rightness of what we're doing here, which I think is obvious, but in the long-term prospects of success. And when you look at it that way, instead of it being kind of an angry fight, it's more of a strategic fight, recognizing that we're going to win. It's a matter of when and where and how. And I think with that in mind, this is not something I've said for the last 20 years of this group. It's time to reach out to the other side and try to find areas of common ground. And it's less combative than you think it is. And I think that needle right now, that little survey today, has moved, what, I said 10 or 11 points in 3 years. It's likely to do that in the next 3. And keep that in mind, because the more it moves, just as it did on the gay rights issue, to where gay marriage, no one now is coming out against all rights for gay. No one is coming out for no rights for gay. And 5, 10, 15 years ago, that's all they said. So watch when you see a locomotive moving like this on social issues, have a little more confidence and have a little more willing to reach out to the other side. I think it's sort of my message today, and I appreciate your time. Thank you for having me.